At 06:45 a.m. on July 15, 1943, Sergeant Ivan Morozov knelt beside the left track of his T-34 tank on the southern edge of Kursk. The air was a mixture of diesel smoke and frost, the kind that burned the lungs before dawn. He scraped a thin layer of frozen mud from the ground and stared at it like a doctor studying blood. Above him, the crew loaded shells, laughing through their fear. Morozov said nothing. He knew that before noon, most of the tanks around them would stop, not because of enemy fire, but because of heat and suffocation. The T-34 was the pride of the Red Army, a steel beast that had saved Moscow and rolled through the snows of Stalingrad. On paper it was perfect. In the manuals, its diesel engine could breathe through storms of dust and survive weeks without maintenance. But that was summer theory. Kursk was a different world. The ground was half mud, half frozen ash. Every shell that hit nearby sent clouds of soot and powdered soil into the air. The fine particles slipped past the engine's metal filters, mixed with oil vapor, and formed a sticky film that choked the cylinders. Crews complained that their tanks died mid-battle, the engines seizing in less than 10 minutes of combat. Commanders called it operator error. Factories denied any fault. The problem was invisible, and therefore it did not exist. Yet the men at the front watched their machines burn, one after another, without a single enemy shell touching them. To them, the real killer was not the Tiger tank or the Luftwaffe, but the silence that followed a sudden stall. Inside a stopped T-34, a crew could only wait for the German gunners to finish what the air itself had begun. In the first week of July, Morozov buried 4 friends. The first was Corporal Semyon, whose tank stopped on a slope outside Prokhorovka. Smoke rose from the rear deck, slow and gray. By the time the hatch opened, the fire had already eaten the air. 2 days later, crew number 312 tried to cross the same ridge. Their engine coughed twice and froze. The radio went silent. When the field cooled, the tank's shell melted into the mud like a tombstone. Every report carried the same line: driver error. Overheating due to poor maintenance. Morozov read them at night, the paper trembling under his dirty fingers. He knew Semyon had checked every valve, every cable. The fault was not in the men. It was in the air they breathed through their machines. He could smell it, burnt oil mixed with dust and metal. By the end of the week, his battalion had lost 8 tanks without a single German shell landing within 100 meters. Command wanted answers. Engineers wanted proof. But proof required the next death. Each new battle became an experiment, and every man inside a T-34 was part of the data. Morozov began dismantling the air intake after every battle. He worked alone, crouched behind the hull while the others smoked or wrote letters home. One night he ran his fingers through the intake mesh and felt something different. The metal was no longer smooth. It pulsed faintly with trapped pressure, like a lung struggling to breathe. He removed the screen and found a thick paste coating the inside, a mixture of soot, frozen oil, and fine mud. It was gray at the edges, black at the center, solid enough to hold a screwdriver upright. He tapped it once and listened. The sound was dull, lifeless, like a hammer against wet earth. When the engine inhaled, the sludge quivered but did not move. That was it. The T-34 was suffocating. Every intake stroke pulled in less air, more residue, until the fire inside the cylinders starved itself to death. Morozov whispered to himself, "It breathes through mud." The manual said nothing about this. The engineers in Moscow had never fought through a thawing field under artillery fire. They built tanks for numbers, not for lungs. He closed the hatch and stared at the frozen earth around him, realizing the ground itself was killing them. When Morozov brought his findings to the maintenance tent, the officers laughed. The regulation book was clear. The air filter system of the T-34 was within factory tolerance. He was a mechanic, not an engineer. His duty was to clean, not to question. Major Vasilev flipped the page and said, "The filters are designed for desert dust, comrade. If they fail in mud, it is because you failed to maintain them. The conversation ended with a stamp and a signature, sealing the problem inside paper. Outside, the snow was melting into dark veins of water. The field smelled of diesel and thawing corpses. Morozov wiped his hands and looked toward the silent tanks parked in rows, each with its engine cover removed like a chest open for surgery. He could not tell which would die next. He only knew they all would. In the following days, he tried smaller fixes. He cleaned the mesh twice a day, packed rags around the intake edges, even poured boiling water to dissolve the clogs. Nothing worked. The next battle near Panairai proved it. 2 tanks stopped within 5 minutes, smoke pouring from their vents. He could hear the panic through the radio, crews coughing, screaming, metal shrieking before the ammunition cooked off. Then only static. When the survivors returned, headquarters sent inspectors. They asked for measurements, not memories. Was the engine running above 2,000 RPM? Was the oil pressure normal? Every question assumed the machine was guilty of nothing. Each answer Morozov gave, about the smell, the feel, the strange vibration before death, was dismissed as anecdote. Feelings are not data, one engineer said. If you want to save tanks, save your hands for maintenance. But feelings were all a mechanic had. He could feel when steel was about to crack, when a track bolt had loosened, when the engine's heartbeat skipped a beat. The system did not feel. It only recorded. To the bureaucracy, death without documentation was not real. Morozov stopped writing reports. He began keeping his own notebook, hidden inside the lining of his coat. Each page listed a tank number, the date, the condition of the filter, and a short note in pencil, black paste. No airflow. Crew dead. The entries filled faster than he could tear the paper from enemy propaganda leaflets. At night, he would stare at the crude Soviet star printed on the corner and wonder if the symbol meant anything to the men buried beneath it. The factory representatives finally visited the front in late June. They arrived in clean uniforms and shiny boots, walking between the wrecks as if touring a museum. One of them, a young engineer from Kharkov, asked to see the filters. Morozov handed him a piece of the clogged mesh. The man frowned, rubbed it with his glove, and said, "Contamination due to poor cleaning procedures." Then he threw it away. Morozov felt something break inside him, not anger, but resignation. The war was being fought by hands, yet ruled by signatures. And signatures never bled. That night, he sat by the fire with 2 fellow mechanics. One of them, Anton, joked, "Maybe we should fill the filters with vodka. At least they'll die happy." Morozov didn't laugh. He stared into the flames and said quietly, "Maybe we should fill them with mud." Anton thought he was joking, but Morozov was not. If the air was killing the tanks, maybe the ground could save them. The idea was absurd, unscientific, even suicidal. But so was dying in a steel coffin because no one believed the evidence of his hands. The next morning, he approached the supply officer for permission to modify the filters. The officer refused. "Unauthorized alteration of factory equipment is sabotage," he said. "You could be shot." Morozov nodded, saluted, and walked away. He understood. The army would rather lose tanks than lose control. He looked at the frozen ground again. The mud was waiting. The order was clear: no unauthorized modification to factory equipment. The punishment was equally clear: court-martial, possibly a bullet. Morozov read that line every morning on the maintenance board, then went back to work pretending it meant someone else. But by mid-July, after watching another T-34 die without a scratch on its armor, he stopped pretending. That night, while the camp slept beneath a sky the color of gunmetal, Morozov and his loader Anton carried 2 wooden buckets toward the supply trench. The ground was half frozen, half rot. Each step made a wet sound like breathing. They dug at the edge of a shell crater until the shovel struck something thick, a layer of dark clay mixed with burned fuel. It smelled of iron, cordite, and old blood. Perfect. They filled the buckets to the brim and hauled them back to the service shed behind the line of tanks. The air was cold enough to bite, but sweat still ran down Morozov's neck. He shut the door and struck a match. The single flame trembled against the steel hull of his machine. It looked like a candle at a funeral. Anton whispered, "You really think mud will save an engine?" Morozov didn't answer. He dipped his hands into the bucket and felt the weight, the stickiness. "Mud saves soldiers," he said. "It swallows bullets, hides footprints, buries the dead. Maybe it can protect machines too." They stripped the air intake housing and laid it open like a ribcage. Inside, the metal mesh still carried the scars of heat and soot. Morozov took a spoon from his coat pocket, a mess spoon, slightly bent, and began pressing the mud into the outer edge of the filter. Not sealing it, just coating it. The mixture of earth and oil clung to the mesh like flesh to bone. He shaped it carefully, leaving a narrow circle in the middle for air to pass. The process took 10 minutes. The silence between them felt heavier than the mud. Outside, artillery thundered in the distance like slow heartbeats. Anton lit another match. His face flickered orange. "If they find this, they'll shoot us." Morozov nodded. "Then we better make sure it works." By dawn, they had finished all 4 filters. The smell of damp soil filled the compartment. Morozov reassembled the housing, turned the bolts tight, and sat for a moment on the tread. His hands were raw, his nails black. The tank looked no different from the others. That was the point. When the attack began that morning, the battalion moved through fog thick enough to taste. German shells fell short, throwing up fountains of mud that rained onto the advancing line. One by one, engines coughed, sputtered, and died. The same sound as always. But Morozov's tank kept moving. The needle on the temperature gauge stayed steady. The engine tone changed, lower, slower, deliberate, but alive. He felt the difference through his boots. The machine was breathing, but this time through its own armor. As they crested a ridge, another T-34 beside them stalled and burst into smoke. The gunner cursed. Morozov throttled forward, firing on the move. The turret shook, spent casings clanged against the floor. His crew didn't cheer, they were too busy staying alive. When the radio crackled with orders to retreat, his was one of the few voices that could answer. After the battle, the others came to look. The mud around his filters had hardened into a shell of reddish clay. It was warm to the touch. One mechanic tapped it with a wrench and said, "What the hell is this?" Morozov shrugged. "Armor for air." By nightfall, 5 other crews were experimenting. They used whatever soil they could find, wet, dry, mixed with fuel, even with snow. The results were uneven, but the intent spread faster than any directive. Within a week, half the battalion had armored lungs, and breakdowns dropped sharply. Command never issued an order. They simply stopped asking questions. Reports said, improved engine endurance under field conditions. No mention of mud, no mention of Morozov. He didn't mind. The less said, the safer it was. He washed his hands, the cracks in his skin still holding traces of earth, and marked a single line in his hidden notebook. July 15th. Engine breathed through mud. Crew survived. The first real test came 2 days later, when the German counterattack rolled over the southern ridge. The morning was gray, the air heavy with the smell of burned rubber and metal. Morozov's tank sat in a line of 20, engines idling low, exhaust clouds drifting like ghosts across the field. Over the radio came the order, advance and hold the ridge. He felt the engine hum beneath his boots, slow but steady. Normally by this point, the intake would rattle, the filters wheezing like a dying lung. Now it drew air with a deep, patient rhythm. It sounded wrong, but wrong in a good way. When the artillery began to fall, the field turned into smoke and mud. The tanks crawled forward blind, their drivers steering by memory and instinct. Through the gun sight, Morozov saw flashes, German Panzer IVs emerging through the haze. Their first shells slammed into the frozen earth, sending shrapnel ringing against the hull. The gunner fired back, one shot, then another. Each recoil sent vibrations through the hull like a heartbeat. Inside the cabin, the air stayed clean. No smoke leaked through the vents, no oily choke in the throat. 5 minutes into the fight, he heard the familiar sound, another T-34 coughing, its engine dying mid-turn. Then another. The voices over the radio grew desperate, overlapping calls for tow cables, fire extinguishers, medics. Engine failure. We're hit. No, not hit. And then static. But their tank kept moving. The engine stayed alive, its rhythm like a drum under pressure. Anton shouted coordinates. The loader fed shells. The turret swung in slow arcs, the cannon firing until the recoil left their arms numb. Through gaps in the smoke, Morozov could see burning wrecks scattered across the field. His comrades' tanks stopped cold, their armor glowing orange. He pressed his hand against the steel wall and whispered, "Breathe, old man." The engine obeyed. It roared, steady, almost calm. They pushed up the slope and reached the crest. For a moment, the sky cleared enough for him to see the valley below, lines of German armor retreating, some already aflame. Then a shell hit close, knocking the breath from every lung inside. Dirt rained through the open periscope. Morozov checked the gauges again, oil pressure stable, temperature steady. The mud armor was holding. The intake didn't scream or clog. It hummed like a throat coated in stone. By afternoon, the ridge belonged to them. Out of 20 tanks that started the assault, only 7 still ran. Of those 7, 4 carried Morozov's crude mud filters. The others had burned out before noon. When they rolled back to refuel, the mechanics gathered around his machine, tapping the intake covers, scraping at the dried crust with their knives. One piece flaked off, revealing hard red clay baked solid by heat. It looked like pottery. One soldier laughed, saying, "Comrade, you built a tank out of a flower pot." Morozov said nothing. He just unscrewed the intake and showed them the clean metal inside. Not a trace of soot, not a smear of black oil. It gleamed silver in the lamplight, like a lung that had learned to breathe again. That night, no one spoke of disobedience. They shared vodka poured into tin cups and called it the air of Kursk. Even the officers looked the other way. Results were results, and survival was its own permission. The following morning, 3 other mechanics came to him quietly before dawn. They brought buckets, shovels, and spoons from the mess. One of them said, "Show us how." Morozov didn't smile. He only pointed to the ditch by the frozen stream. "There," he said, "take what the earth gives. Press it into the mesh. Leave a hole no bigger than your fist." By nightfall, more than a dozen tanks carried the same crude protection. Each one looked identical on the outside, but inside, the machines breathed through the same earth. The mud trick had become a code, passed by hand, never written. Morozov made a final note in his hidden book, July 17th. First battle survived. 4 tanks lived. Mud armor effective. He closed the notebook and listened to the engines outside. For the first time since the offensive began, he believed they might live to see another morning. By late July, the story of the mud filters had moved faster than any official order. No dispatch carried it. No document mentioned it. But everywhere along the Kursk line, men began arriving at the maintenance pits with buckets, oil cans, and shovels. They came from tank brigades Morozov had never met. Men from Orel, from Belgorod, even from divisions supposedly still refitting hundreds of kilometers away. No one asked where the idea started. It spread like rumor, like faith, like the way soldiers pass a cigarette before dawn. The new crews did it their own way. Some mixed the soil with oil to keep it from freezing. Others added straw or paper scraps for texture. A few used clay from riverbeds, claiming it baked harder. The methods differed, but the logic stayed the same. Slow the air, trap the dust, save the lungs. They called it the breathing armor, half joke, half ritual. When a tank rolled out for battle, someone always slapped the hull and said, "Let it breathe slow." Command took notice. The rate of engine loss had fallen dramatically, yet no one could explain why. Reports came in from multiple units. Improved endurance under harsh dust conditions. The same phrase repeated, copy-pasted through channels. When officers asked for specifics, the mechanics shrugged. Just better cleaning, Comrade Colonel. In truth, every cleaning left behind the same red crust. One evening, a logistics officer from headquarters came to inspect Morozov's battalion. He was young, polished, fresh from the academy. His boots were still black. As he walked through the rows of tanks, he noticed the hardened mud around their filters and frowned. "This is irregular," he said. "These modifications are not authorized." Morozov stood at attention, his face blank. "Yes, comrade officer." "Who ordered this?" "No one. The ground did." The man hesitated. He tapped one of the filters with his pen. The sound was like stone. "Remove them before the next inspection," he said finally, and left without writing a single note. The next day, another shelling hit their position. 3 tanks without mud filters caught fire within minutes. No one mentioned the order again. By the first week of August, the mud trick had reached other fronts. Crews on the Bryansk and Smolensk sectors began adopting it, claiming it reduced intake flashbacks during urban fighting. Someone said a captured German mechanic had been overheard asking, "Why do the Russian engines no longer choke?" It was working. Quietly, invisibly, it was working. Among the men, the act took on a strange reverence. They began to mix the mud carefully, almost ceremonially, before each battle. Some spat into the bucket for luck. Some crossed themselves before applying the first smear. Morozov watched them and thought how odd it was that in a war of machines, survival now depended on something as ancient as dirt. He received a letter from his sister in Saratov that week. She wrote, "They say the battle is going well. The papers call it the turning of the war. I hope your tanks are strong." He folded the letter carefully and slipped it into his coat. The tanks were strong, he thought, because they had learned humility. They had learned to breathe through the earth. At night, in the lull between bombardments, the mechanics gathered in the pit behind the line. They didn't drink or boast. They simply talked about how much mud to use, how to keep the air channels clear. The conversations sounded more like farmers discussing soil than soldiers planning war. One said, "Maybe after this, I'll go home and build stoves. I'm good with clay now." Another answered, "Maybe clay builds us instead." The results were impossible to ignore. The survival rate of T-34's and Morozov's regiment doubled within a month. Fuel consumption dropped. Fires became rare. Some commanders, desperate for explanation, credited divine intervention. Others quietly noted the maintenance initiative and let it stand. War has no patience for miracles that can't be filed, so it became a statistic instead. When the rains came again, the mud softened, peeled, and fell away. But by then, every mechanic knew what to do. They replaced it without orders, as naturally as reloading ammunition. A living rhythm had formed: battle, repair, mix, coat, breathe. The earth and the machine had become partners. Morozov no longer wrote notes in his secret book. He didn't need to. The proof was all around him, in engines that still turned, in crews that came back for supper. He sometimes caught himself smiling when he passed the tanks at dusk, each carrying its thin film of clay like a scar earned in silence. One night, Anton said, "You think they'll ever give you a medal for this?" Morozov shook his head. "No one gets medals for mud." The loader grinned. "Then the mud will remember." Outside, the wind carried the faint rumble of distant engines, tanks moving, still breathing through the soil of Kursk. The Germans first noticed it in late August. Reports from forward observation posts began to describe an anomaly. Soviet tanks, once prone to engine fires after long engagements, were now lasting hours, even days, under continuous combat. Panzer crews had grown accustomed to watching the T-34's choke themselves to death in their own smoke. But lately, the old pattern had vanished. The Russian machines seemed quieter. The exhaust was darker, slower. And when they burned, it took artillery, not luck, to stop them. At the 17th Panzer Regiment, Captain Franz Muller filed the first detailed complaint. His reconnaissance unit had destroyed 6 T-34's near Aboyne, yet when his mechanics examined the wrecks, they found the strangest residue, a layer of hardened clay fused around the air intakes, like ceramic armor. Possibly camouflage, the report suggested, or some primitive insulation against heat. But when a technician struck it with a wrench, it rang like fired pottery. Beneath it, the filters were remarkably clean. The engines had died from penetration, not from overheating. German engineers at the front debated for days. Some argued that the Russians had developed a new alloy coating. Others believed it was a factory adaptation to counter phosphorus munitions. No one guessed that the answer lay in a bucket of soil from the battlefield itself. The Wehrmacht sent fragments of the hardened clay to Berlin for analysis. The chemists concluded it was ordinary earth, high in silica, baked by exhaust heat. The report ended with a single line, purpose unknown. Meanwhile, the confusion bled into combat doctrine. Tank gunners were told to aim lower, toward treads or turrets, since engine shots no longer produced the familiar instant flames. The Luftwaffe's Ju-87 pilots complained that even direct strafing runs failed to ignite Soviet armor. They moved through dust like ghosts, one pilot wrote in his diary, breathing through the mud itself. In September, the Germans captured an intact T-34 near Belgorod. It had thrown a track while retreating and been abandoned. Inside, the interior smelled of wet soil and diesel. When the inspection team removed the filter housing, they found the same ring of hardened mud pressed neatly along the intake mesh. A sergeant tried to scrape it off and nearly broke his knife. It wasn't paint or sealant. It was earth baked into stone. Colonel Weiss, the officer in charge, sent a telegram. Russians employing field modification. Material, local clay mixed with fuel residue. Function uncertain, appears to slow airflow. Suggest intelligence contacts Soviet prisoners for clarification. 2 days later, a captured driver was brought in. He was 19, wounded, half-conscious. When asked about the clay, he simply said, "For breathing." The interpreter pressed him to explain. The boy repeated, "So the tank can breathe slower." Then he fainted. The report went nowhere. Higher command considered it superstition. A general scrawled across the margin, "Nonsense. Russian mysticism. Proceed with technical evaluation." Yet on the front, where superstition often saved lives, German crews began experimenting on their own. At least 3 panzer units tried coating their air intakes with mud, but the results were mixed. The heavier Maybach engines reacted poorly. The filters overheated or choked completely. What worked for the T-34 did not translate to German precision machinery. The irony was bitter. The supposedly crude Soviet tanks had found salvation in crudeness itself. By October, intelligence officers finally compiled enough observations to mark a trend. The average operational time of a Soviet tank engine had nearly doubled compared to spring figures. Reports of engine fires in intercepted Soviet radio traffic had almost disappeared. The enemy had adapted, invisibly, inexplicably. In Berlin, the Ministry of Armaments dismissed the data. Russian exaggeration, they wrote. Impossible under field conditions. But in the ruins of Kursk, every panzer crewman knew otherwise. They could see it in the way the T-34's kept coming, moving through clouds of grit that would have choked any other machine. One gunner said, "They're built from the same mud we crawl in. Maybe that's why they never stop." Morozov never heard any of this, of course. He was too busy keeping his own machines alive. Yet he noticed the change in the enemy's behavior. German artillery began targeting fuel depots and bridges instead of tanks, trying to starve them rather than burn them. The pattern was obvious to anyone who lived long enough to notice patterns. One afternoon, while cleaning the filter housing after another battle, Anton chuckled and said, "You know they're afraid of us now?" Morozov looked up from his work. "They should be afraid of dirt." Anton laughed. "Imagine engineers in Berlin sitting around, studying mud." Morozov smiled faintly, a rare thing. "Then maybe they'll finally understand the earth wins every war. By autumn's end, the myth of the mud armor had grown even stranger. German soldiers claimed the Russians mixed the soil with ground glass or animal blood to strengthen it. Some said it was a secret resin imported from America. The truth was simpler and far more humiliating to the Reich. What had baffled their engineers was nothing more than the battlefield itself turned into a tool. The final German intelligence bulletin on the matter, dated November 10, 1943, concluded, "Observed field modification among Soviet armored divisions involves application of local clay to engine air intakes, believed to act as heat dispersal medium or primitive fire retardant. No practical countermeasure required." No countermeasure was required because no one understood it. By then, the front had already moved west. The Red Army no longer needed permission for its machines to breathe. And in the wreckage left behind, among the burned panzers and frozen corpses, a few fragments of baked clay still clung stubbornly to rusting steel, silent, meaningless to those who found them, but to Morozov's crews, proof that life could grow even in the lungs of a dying war. When the snows returned to Kursk, the front had already shifted hundreds of kilometers west. The tanks that survived the summer were patched, painted, and sent north to support new offensives. The men who drove them were different, older, quieter, made of fatigue and smoke. Morozov's crew was still together, though thinner, paler, and marked by the season's work. Their machine, number 417, still carried its faint crust of dried earth, chipped by frost, but never fully removed. At the repair depot in Bryansk, a new batch of officers arrived, engineers from the Kharkov factory, now rebuilt after evacuation. They came with clipboards, clean uniforms, and orders to standardize field modifications. They examined each surviving T-34, noted every scratch, every improvised detail. When they reached Morozov's tank, one of them frowned at the hardened clay around the intake and said, "Remove this debris." Morozov obeyed without argument. He pried off the crust piece by piece, setting the fragments carefully on a canvas sheet. The young engineer scraped one with his pencil and watched gray dust fall. "Interesting texture," he murmured. "Perhaps the exhaust interacts chemically with silica content." He wrote notes for 10 minutes, then ordered samples sent back to Kharkov for study. 3 months later, a circular appeared through official channels. Updated air filtration modification, field tested. Kharkov Improvement Type D provides increased resistance to dust and heat. There was no mention of Kursk or of Morozov, or of the men who had first mixed the earth by hand. The army celebrated the innovation as a triumph of Soviet engineering. Photographs showed smiling designers posing beside factory-fresh tanks. Anton brought one of those newspapers to the barracks. "Look," he said, tapping the picture. "Our mud has gone to college." They both laughed, but it was a tired sound. Later that evening, when the factory engineers hosted a small ceremony to mark the successful adaptation, Morozov and his crew were not invited. Their names were not in the report. They were reassigned south, to the Dnieper crossings. The official paperwork described them as experienced maintenance personnel. Nothing else. He didn't mind, or at least he told himself he didn't. Recognition was for those who wrote things down, not those who built them. His only pride was mechanical. The engine started on the first crank, and that was enough. Still, when the first snowfall covered the field, he found himself looking at the footprints the way a farmer studies soil, wondering whether anything ever truly belonged to the men who touched it first. That winter was quiet but cruel. Frost settled deep into the metal, and engines froze every morning. The new filters worked well. Even the officers admitted it. Sometimes, as Morozov tightened bolts with numb fingers, he would hear someone nearby joke, "Don't forget the Kharkov mud, comrade." He never corrected them. The words were harmless. The truth was not. After the war ended, the army released him with a citation for technical diligence under combat conditions. No medals, no commendations. Just a folded paper and a ticket home. He returned to Saratov and opened a small garage behind his cousin's house. The sign above the door read simply, "Repairs done honestly." The years passed quietly. Customers came with tractors, trucks, bicycles. He never mentioned the war unless asked, and even then he spoke only of engines, never of men. The old notebook stayed locked in a tin box under the floorboards, its pages brittle, filled with numbers and short sentences. In 1951, a newspaper article celebrated the legendary reliability of the T-34 and mentioned that its improved filter design had been perfected after field feedback from heroic crews. The article named 3 engineers, none of whom had seen the front. Morozov read it at his workbench, wiped grease from his hands, and folded the page carefully. "Field feedback," he murmured. "Yes, that's one way to say it." Anton visited once, bringing a bottle of vodka and a grin that hadn't aged well. They sat in the cold workshop, surrounded by the smell of oil and rust. "They forgot us," Anton said. Morozov poured 2 glasses. "Good. Let them forget. It means we lived." They drank to that. 2 mechanics, 2 ghosts of a war that no longer needed their names. Outside, snow fell onto the cracked asphalt, melting into thin streaks of brown water that looked, under the light, almost like mud. In the spring of 1960, a curator at the Kubinka Tank Museum unpacked a shipment of battlefield relics from the Kursk region. Among the twisted steel and burnt track links lay a single, well-preserved intake housing from a T-34. It was coated in a thin shell of reddish clay, fused hard as stone. When the curator tried to clean it, the brush snapped. He marked it as unknown field adaptation, placed it on a wooden stand, and moved on. Months later, a retired mechanic named Ivan Morozov visited the museum with his nephew. His hair was gray, his hands still rough from years of turning bolts. They wandered among the exhibits, past Panthers and Shermans, until he stopped in front of that single, rusted piece. The placard read, T-34 engine intake, Kursk, 1943. Unidentified modification. He leaned close, touching the rough surface with one finger. It felt warm, even in the cool hall. The boy beside him asked, "Did you fight here?" Morozov nodded once. "I fixed them." He said nothing else. He didn't mention the buckets, or the night in the shed, or the smell of wet earth. He didn't need to. The proof was here, silent, covered in dust. That evening, as they left the museum, the sun caught the horizon in the same dull orange he remembered from the battlefield. The boy asked why the tanks were all made of gray metal. Morozov smiled faintly. "Because the mud remembers the color," he said. Years later, when the museum restored the exhibit, workers discovered faint letters scratched into the steel rim. They were barely visible, worn by time and rust. Morozov, Kursk, 1943. No one could say who he was. The curator added a note to the archive, possibly a mechanic. In the end, that was enough. History seldom records the men who keep machines alive. Their hands vanish, but the things they touched endure. The tanks that crossed the Dnieper, the engines that roared in Berlin, all breathe through the same humble principle born in the mud of Kursk. Some nights, the veterans who survived would still tell the story in fragments, about a nameless sergeant who taught the tanks to breathe slower, to stay calm in smoke. No one agreed on his name, or his unit, or even if he truly existed. But every time an old T-34 started on the first turn, someone would nod and say, "The earth still helps him." And somewhere beneath layers of rust and memory, in a forgotten field once soaked with oil and blood, pieces of that hardened clay still sleep inside the bones of the machines he saved, uncharted, uncredited, unbroken.